Chapter 30. Smokin. Eddie and the boys weren't only fascinated with fire. They liked smoke, too. One day their parents had to be away, so they had hired a babysitter. By this time, Eddie was a young teenager, and he was a little miffed that his parents didn't trust him to look after the tribe. After all, hadn't he proved himself responsible time after time? Hadn't he? The babysitter came huffing up the hill and plopped into a chair. She looked around at the house and the boys. She asked about the bathroom. She considered asking for a raise even before the job began. As the morning progressed, though, she realized the work wasn't so bad. The boys were entertaining themselves and things seemed to be under control. In fact, she was beginning to get a little bored and hungry. She looked around for something to heat up in the oven, but when she went to turn it on, she realized it wasn't like her oven at home. This was a gas oven. Not to be outdone, she looked around the kitchen and found a box of Ohio blue tip matches, the kind you can strike anywhere. She opened the door to the oven, turned on the gas, and just then the phone rang. She'd given the number to her boyfriend. Her face lit up with pleasure as she talked to him, trying to think of flirty things to say. She wandered around the kitchen, pulling the long phone cord behind her. She giggled and looked out the window. She lowered her voice to share some secret with the boy. Finally, after a few minutes, she ran out of conversation and had to say goodbye. Because her ear had been pressed to the phone the whole time, she was unaware of the faint hiss of gas that had persisted throughout the call. She hung up and turned back to the oven. Innocently, she picked up the box of Ohio blue tips and pulled one out. She scratched it on the box. Ka-whoom! The boys, sprawled out on the couch in the living room reading old National Geographics, felt the house shake. A couple of pictures fell off the wall. They leapt off the couch and dashed into the living room. What they saw stunned them. There was the babysitter, dazed and upside down beneath the dining room table. Bits of smoke curled up from where her eyebrows had been. They followed her trail back into the kitchen that looked like a war zone. Chairs were overturned. Pots lay on the floor. A smoky smell hung in the air. "What happened?" they asked, after the babysitter recovered a bit. "Well, I got this call from my boyfriend," she began. Eddie lifted an unsinged eyebrow and looked sagely at his brothers. "Boys, let that be a lesson to you. Love," he said knowingly, "can be a dangerous thing." A few weeks later, Eddie and his brothers were sitting around that same dining room table. They were trying to think up something to do, but they were avoiding the word bored at all costs. That word was worse than a cuss word to their mother. If she ever heard them say they were bored, she'd find them something to do, usually chores. Eddie's mom plopped down at the table and looked around. Her eyes fell on a pack of cigarettes a visitor had left the day before. Now, she was a brilliant woman and more than just a little sneaky. "Hey," she said, casually picking up the pack of cigarettes. "You boys ever wonder what it'd be like to smoke a cigarette?" Eddie looked at his brothers in bewilderment. Most mothers were threatening to skin their kids alive if they dared to smoke, and here was his mom offering to light one up with them. He suspected something, but shrugged his shoulders and reached for a cigarette. So did the other boys. His mom fetched the Ohio blue tips from the kitchen and carefully lit each boy's cigarette. Then she lit her own and sat back to take a puff. One after another, each of her sons followed her example. They practiced holding the cigarette in different ways, trying to see who could look the coolest. They took tentative little puffs, not daring to inhale deeply. They worked on their flicking skills, trying to get the ash to fall in the ashtray. They weren't very disappointed when the cigarette finally burnt down to a smoldering stub, which they ground out in the ashtray. Their mother didn't say a word. The next morning, the boys woke up with a taste in their mouths like they'd spent the night licking out ashtrays. As hard as they brushed their teeth and rinsed their mouth, they could not get rid of the noxious flavor. When they sat down at the breakfast table, their toast and eggs tasted like charcoal. "I'm not sure what people see in smoking," was all their mother said. With that simple phrase, she'd taken the rebellious fun out of sneaking behind her back to light up a cigarette. Eddie and his brothers knew they'd been had. Now, Eddie's mom wasn't the only sneaky one in the family. When it came to sneakiness, the apple didn't fall too far from the tree. Eddie decided to play a trick on his foster brother, Bill. Bill was a mischievous 12-year-old with a dimple and an infectious grin that could get him out of about anything. He also had a tobacco habit, but he didn't smoke. He either chewed Red Man or dipped snuff. One day, Eddie and Bill were heading back to the house from Racine. They were walking along the hot railroad tracks, Bill masterfully spitting tobacco juice 15 feet into the blackberry bushes along the right-of-way. Eddie, on a whim, asked for a chew. He knew the danger of swallowing the juice, so as he carefully tucked a small wad between his lip and gum, he made sure not to accidentally swallow any juice. Well, Bill admired Eddie for taking a chaw. Perhaps he could make something out of him yet. As they kept walking, Eddie began to get a bit cocky. "Hey, Bill," he said, "want to have a spit-swallowing contest?" Now, there was no way in the world that Eddie was going to really swallow the tobacco juice. He knew it would make him very sick. Instead, he planned to sneakily spit out his juice whenever Bill wasn't looking. Bill, on the other hand, had been chewing tobacco ever since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. He could swallow spit all day long and not feel a thing. "Bring it on," he said, with his famous grin. So they kept walking, stepping from one creosoted railroad tie to another, and not spitting. Except when Bill had his head turned. Bill cheerfully prattled on, pointing out birds and looking at the clouds in the sky. Eddie started to get quieter and quieter. He began to feel a bit green about the gills. He was certain he'd been careful not to swallow any tobacco juice. What was going on? As they climbed the hill to the house, it was all Eddie could do to keep his feet under him. Things began to spin, and his knees wobbled. When they got to the yard, Eddie pitched over on the grass in the shade of the old apple tree. Everything began to go dark. He felt like he was looking up from the bottom of a deep well. And then he passed out. When at last Eddie came to, Bill was looking down at him. He had that famous smile going, and the dimple flashed. His blue eyes twinkled, and he said, "Well, Eddie, I guess you lost." "I guess I did," moaned Eddie. He never tried tobacco again. Ricky, the boy's friend from Racine, probably wished he'd never tried tobacco. One day he decided to hike around the hillside to visit the boys. On the way out the door of his house, he grabbed a cigarette when his mother wasn't looking. He had a plan. A half-mile around the hillside, there was an abandoned coal mine. It wasn't a commercial mine, just what they used to call a house mine. It wasn't more than a 3-foot-high opening under a layer of sandstone where folks had dug coal for their fireplaces. Eddie and the boys had poked their heads in before, but after crawling in a few feet, it sort of petered out. Ricky had chosen this spot as the most secret and safe place he could imagine to smoke his cigarette. No one would see him here. So, after checking to see if anybody was coming, he scrambled up the bank, through the greenbrier vines, and ducked into the opening. Once inside, he pulled out the slightly crumpled cigarette and fished for a match. Kawoom! There was a flash and a roar, and the next thing Ricky knew, he was lying out on the road 10 feet away. He hadn't counted on mine gas, a byproduct of the coal and a real hazard to miners in that area. When he struck the match, he'd ignited the gas. He had sailed like a cannonball out of the mouth of the mine. He picked himself up and felt around for broken bones. Everything seemed to be in order, though his face was stinging. When Ricky finally came panting up the hill to the farmhouse, he was met in the yard by the boys. They weren't sure they recognized him, so they got closer. "Ricky? Is that you?" "Sure is. Why?" "Well, your face is red as a beet, and you haven't got any eyebrows." "Yeah, well, it's kind of hard to explain," said Ricky, looking at the ground. You don't have to explain anything," said the boys. "We've seen this before, on our babysitter. You're in love, aren't you?"